Hi, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome back to Valley Beth Shalom. This is our first episode of Torah study remotely and online as we cope with this coronavirus crisis. But it is my pleasure once again to welcome my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Marc Gellman, who's with us this morning to do Torah study. This morning, we're going to move beyond the actual Torah reading for this Shabbos and begin our preparations for Passover. Begin talking a little bit about Pesach, its meaning as a holiday, its significance for Jewish families, and the texts that go along with Pesach. So, Marc, let me ask you, when you grew up, did you do Pesach at home? Was it a big deal?
Oh, it was a huge deal. The whole family got together, and the biggest part of the whole meal was when everything was done, and my cousins and I would yell at each other, and we'd have political arguments, and everyone would scream at each other. And for me, this is where all of my argumentative skills, all of my ability to communicate, it was all built on Pesach and on the family yelling and screaming and talking with each other. We had one Passover, we had Father Tom with us. And at the end of the meal, and we're doing all our yelling and screaming and talking, and he went to the door to go home, and he said, if we ever talked like that in our home, I would figure my parents were getting divorced. So, yes, it was a special time.
In my house, in my home, it was my father and mother owned and ran a bakery.
Yeah, of course.
So, first of all, getting ready for Pesach was a nightmare because the bakery was, even though it wasn't kosher Pesach, the bakery was very, very busy. And then they would come home and they'd have a week off. And it was really, except for a little time in the summer, it was the only week during the year my father was actually home. And Pesach for a baker is an interesting moment because it really is a holiday of freedom. And it was a big deal. And what would happen, especially that I remember this very vividly. So my grandmother, my father's mother, my paternal grandmother was one of five siblings. There were three sisters and two brothers. And the brothers, of course, were married. The sisters were married. And they all come to the Seder, and they all hated each other. Their father had been a Talmid Chacham. Their father was a great Rav, an Eastern European rabbi, and they had come to Kenosha, Wisconsin, from Winnipeg, Canada, and before that from someplace god awful in Eastern Europe. And the five siblings had split up the world. One of my aunts, Aunt Sarah, was a socialist, communist union organizer. And my bubby was a Zionist. And my Aunt Rosie owned half of Beverly Hills. She was a capitalist. And Uncle Laser was a great educator, and Uncle Muttle was a great scholar. And they'd all come, and they would, my mom, who was the other side of the family, of course, would sit them all together so they could fight with each other, which was just a joy. It was just a joy. And I said, Mike, Mom, it's cruel to put Aunt Sonia next to Aunt Sarah. She said, yeah, but, let's see what happens. But what happened is you would reiterate all of the great debates of the Jewish 19th and 20th century at the end of the table, Trotskyites versus
Right.
Stalinists and Zionists versus America first kind of nationalists and capitalists versus socialists and religious Jews versus assimilationists. And that was the Seder. I mean, they quickly got away from the Haggadah text because their own text was a lot more interesting.
Well, I don't know how far, if I could say, I don't think they did get that far away from it, either in your home or in my home, which sound very similar. And that's because at the basis of it all, Ed, was the idea that ideas matter, that ideas really, really matter. And that's really the idea of the Haggadah, that ideas matter, that whether we came out of Egypt or not, the point is what matters is the beliefs about God bringing us out and the destiny of freedom and the right of freedom. And these are ideas. And that's what makes one of the things that makes Pesach so unique, I think, in the Jewish cycle of holidays. It's the true intellectual holiday. It's not just a holiday with rituals involving like the sukkah or if you look at Purim, Shalach Manas, and there's rituals with other holidays, but Passover is a compilation of everything we believe. And it's everything we believe about God and freedom. Now, what is more important than that? Nothing is more important than that. So I think it comes that the small part about this that I wanted to add in about Passover that's easily overlooked by intellectuals like us is the food. And that is, Passover represented a kind of distillation of our legacy in food, our culinary legacy. So, the tegel at the end with the honey drizzled over it, and the carrot simis, and even such a thing as a gefilte fish, which has disappeared from menus nowadays, and chopped liver, and the litany of foods, which you look on your plate and you say, that's our culture. That's part of what we are. Not just belief, but honey drizzled over little balls of something. Never really sure what the tegel were made out of.
You don't want to know.
I don't want to know. All I know is to keep my mouth shut.
Well, that's the same thing with gefilte fish. I mean, gefilte fish is poor people's food. Yes. You have a carp, which is or a pike, which is a nebuch, a skinny, crappy little fish. It's the only thing you could afford, but you had to feed a family of 12. So you scoop out the insides, mix it with breadcrumbs, so you stuff it back in, and you end up with gefilte fish. Right? Same thing with matzo ball soup. You couldn't afford enough soup for everybody, so you dilute it with these ginormous knedel, and everyone gets to eat and gets full. But you're right. I mean, it's on one level, it's ideas, and it's the idea. It's the basic conviction that ideas matter. That's why the Seder begins with a question, which I thought was such a wonderful reflection on who we are. So you said you grew up in a family where they argued. Me too. And more than that, I grew up in a family where questions were encouraged, questions were inspired. And the idea that the child is taught a question as his or her first public presentation of Jewish faith. You stand in the family, you stand on a chair, and you ask, "Ma nishtana halayla hazeh?" Why is tonight different? Which is, first of all, just an enormously powerful question on its own. But that it's the child, that the child is not relegated to silence and invisibility. The child is taught how to ask a question, and that the question is met with smiles and with love, and with about 8 answers in the course of the Seder. But that's such a remarkable idea that you probe, you inquire, you go looking for knowledge. You're permitted to challenge. You're permitted to open the conversation in that way, and that really was my family as well. And as well, the thing that we learned, my brothers and I learned from sitting at that Seder, was that history belonged to us. I mean, I went to school with American kids. This was suburban Los Angeles. They had no history. If you remember asking, the teacher went around and said, "Where did your family come from?" And one kid said, like, Denver, "Where did your family come from?" "Well, my mother's from Romania and Galicia. My father's from Lithuania." We lived history. History belonged to us. Yesterday and the day before made us who we are, and we live in history in that sense. And history can be shaped. The future can be shaped. I mean, at that table were all of these dreamers. There were Zionists and Yiddishists and Stalinists and Trotskyites and communists of various kinds and religious Jews who all believe that somehow Mashiach Tzeit is in our own hands. Yeah. I think that's another powerful element of this.
One thing I would add to that is, and I agree, it really did bring us to a sense of a kind of historical nobility, feeling these roots that but there was another connection, and that was the connection between Passover and America, being an American Jew. Well, the lesson of Passover was freedom, and the lesson of America is freedom. And so our principal holiday combined in perfect equipoise to the principal teaching of the country we're living in, and which had given us more freedom than any country we've ever lived in. So Passover and America were perfect, were like a hand in a glove. They were perfect. And then when I grew older and researched it, and when you see Michael Walzer's work, and you about Passover and freedom, and you look and see the role of the Passover for African Americans, that Moses was for them also part of their story of freedom and liberation, and that we aren't the only ones to have this story. We aren't the only ones, and that also was very powerful for me. And then as I began to love Midrash, I revered the Haggadah as the supreme example of interpreting the stories of the Torah. And Midrash, of course, is a story about a story in the Bible. And it was like the sonnet is unique to English literature. The Midrash is unique to Jewish literature. And the Haggadah is ultimately a collection of stories about stories in the Torah. And that was magnetic for me. To me, because it was an open door. It was saying, look, if you can't do the Talmud, they did that. You can't do anything significant for Judaism there. But they started Midrash, and you can contribute to Midrash. Right now, in this world, today, you can make modern Midrash. And that was, for me, like a clarion call. And so I think the Seder was wonderful. Plus, one final thing, and that is our relationship to Christians and the Passover. In the winter, when we have Hanukkah and Christmas, we lose. We just, we're wiped out. We're crushed. We're squashed. I mean, they've got the Hallelujah chorus, and we've got dreidel, dreidel, dreidel.
Right.
And they got the whole big thing going on. They got trees with lights. In Milwaukee, where I grew up, they had the ornaments with the colored water and the bubbles. And I had like a little paper dreidel that would unfold, and Mom would put it on the credenza. We had nothing. But it was an unfair competition. I felt like really that we came in second by a long way. But in the springtime, Easter and Passover, well, that's a competition we are, bring it on. Because I think Passover stands up against Easter in a very good way. I mean, we don't have the chocolate bunnies, and, okay, and they don't have the horseradish, okay. But basically, I think we do really well in a comparison to Easter.
Wow. So I'm a little younger than you.
Yeah.
And for that reason, the American connection of Pesach for me is a little different. It's interesting because I was already, a young teenager during the Vietnam era, and watching the civil rights movement, the birth of feminism, the 60s and 70s. So here too, it had a strong American resonance, but the opposite of what you mentioned. For us, it was protest. Here was Moses, who after all was the child of slaves, who had tasted the bourgeois life of the palace, but had come back to liberate his people, and who stands in front of power and speaks truth, and declares to Pharaoh that might will not make right forever. That there comes a moment in the history of humanity when right will overcome might, when right becomes mighty, and that the plagues of the society has to suffer as a recompense for its endemic evil, for its evil choices, its evil values, are coming, and they're inevitable, and they're unstoppable, and they're insufferable. And when we saw this society begin to disintegrate in the wake of the latter years of the Vietnam War, when we saw youth running away from home and leaving behind the values of their parents, when we saw the rise of the angry Black community that was regaining its voice, or gaining a voice for the first time, and women gaining a voice for the first time, all of those symbols of the Seder come to capture that. All the symbols resonate with that. It's a different American a different American tradition, but also very, very, very powerfully connected to the moments of the Seder. Plus the fact it was the only time that my mom and dad would let us drink copious amounts of wine. Now, true, it was Manischewitz cherry wine, but listen, when you're 12, 13, 14, you get you take what you can get. So let's follow your lead. Let's open the Haggadah for a moment.
Okay.
Here you have something called a Seder, an ordered ritual. The word Seder means order, of course, right? And the rabbis of the Mishnah put this together. It's in the 10th chapter of Psachim. And they follow their predilection. These poor guys living in the shadow of the destroyed temple, these poor guys living under brutal Roman occupation, these poor guys living in a world of upturned values and upturned structures. And they give us Seder, an ordered ritual. So the first question is, what's the significance of that, of Seder, of order? And then if you had to say, what's the message of the Haggadah? What is it, this text coming to tell us?
Well, let me start with the biggest lesson, I think, for me. And the biggest lesson of the Haggadah for me is that the words of the Torah are continuously alive. They aren't like a really good Shakespeare play or like Moby Dick. They aren't like the greatest literature of the world, the books of the Tanakh, of the Bible. They are something more. There is something in them and in the stories that is beyond literature. And that is the part of the Bible that extends into theology. It is, to put it in, I guess, a simple way, but for me, the most real way, this is a story of what God wants from us and what God has done for us that implicates us in a story that's thousands of years old. It implicates us. When I read Moby Dick, there's nothing. I am not Ishmael. I am not Ahab. I am an outside reader. There's nothing that breaks that fourth wall, nothing that pulls me in. I am not Hamlet. But the Haggadah, and through it, the Torah says, it's because of what God did for me when I left Egypt. It has the theological chutzpah to say, you left Egypt, Gellman. You left Egypt, Feinstein. You left Egypt. And then I'm left to figure out, what the hell does that mean? Because I certainly didn't leave Egypt, but it says you have to see yourself as having left Egypt. To me, that's the heart of it. A text that's more than a text.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful way to look at it. I think for me, Rabbi Schulweis once gave a very nice sermon on a Rosh Hashanah, and he confessed to me later that he was afraid that nobody understood what he said. So he talked about, for some reason, he was reading Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche is the philosopher, 19th century German philosopher. And Nietzsche respected power, and he resented weakness. And one of the things that he pointed out, at least in Nietzsche's conviction, was that it was Jews who reversed the morality of Europe. That the morality of Western civilization was that the powerful were noble, and that the weak were, well, weak. They were less than to be. They were not to be respected, and that you wanted to build a morality that embraced the nobility of power, and a morality that resented or had contempt for weakness. And came along the Jews with their slave mentality and taught this idea that the God of the universe, who is the most powerful force anywhere, loves the weak and cares for the outcast and embraces the disenfranchised and the dispossessed. Nietzsche resented this, and Schulweis took great pride in this. He took great pride in that observation. He says it's true. that we have this very profound vocabulary for how we reach out to those in need and protect them. And for Schulweis, this idea that the purpose of the Seder is to make the case that God demands justice for the weakest among us, and that is the pattern of history, that's the way that history will, in its broadest spectrum, that's the way history will play itself out. And that's a remarkable idea. To me, it's an extraordinary conviction. And some days you can actually believe it, and it takes a moment like the crossing of the Red Sea where you can actually stop and celebrate and sing the song. Otherwise, you look at the world and it's kind of frustrating. I mean, you read the morning newspaper and the rich are getting richer and the weak are getting crushed, and you wonder where is the justice? Where is the justice for this? So I think that for some reason that idea really resonates with me, and as a principle for understanding human existence, and as a central pillar of a faith. So now we open the Haggadah, and we're presented with Seder, how we're going to do this thing. And I think you're right, by the way. I think that the most important line is that line about halfway through. It's actually a quotation from the Mishnah in, again, the 10th chapter of Psachim. B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo kilu yatsa b'Mitzrayim. In every generation, we have to see ourselves as if we came out of Egypt. This is not a history to be commemorated. This is not a memorial to be reiterated. You're there. I mean, in a certain sense, historical memory becomes personal experience. It's internalized as personal experience. You ask a Jewish person for their life story, the first line is, well, I was a slave in Egypt. Now you'll understand who I am. Just a remarkable idea. So we're brought into the Seder, we're brought into the Haggadah as a participant in the historical event itself. You're going to eat what they ate. You're going to feel what they felt. We're going to sit down to the last table that they sat in before they left Egypt, the last meal. There's blood on the doorpost. There's a plague outside. Okay, now let's celebrate. Remarkable tension.
So let me ask you this. So let's go deep on that. The question of Bavu Zeh Sadonai Li. Sadonai Li, what God did for me when I left Egypt. So you can understand it in a completely rational, acceptable, sort of liberal, democratic way. Oh, God helped us to be free, therefore we should help others to be free. I would make the case, as strongly as I am able, that is not what this is about. That's fine. That's a good lesson, and that's a good thing to learn. But that's not what the verse is about. The verse is about something more existentially traumatic, something more existentially outrageous. Somehow, we have to imagine ourselves as actually having personally left Egypt, as actually having been there, Ed. And of all the questions, Rilke talks about problems that we can't solve, but we could perhaps live our way into the answers. Of all the questions I've encountered in all my years as a rabbi, from when I began to study as a boy, this question is the one that has endured over all the days and the years, the decades of my life as a serious Jew. And that is, what does it mean that I left Egypt? And I wanted to ask you what it means to you that you left Egypt, other than the glossy, I should help others because God helped us. Okay, good. Let's get deeper than that. That's good for a high school a sermon for the high school kids. This is you and me, and I'm asking you with sweat on my soul, what have you learned? Like when Buber and Rosenzweig, who had a friendship very much like your friendship with me, and Rosenzweig asked Buber, why don't you do any of the mitzvahs? And Buber asked him, why do you do this one? Do you do that one? Do you do kashrut? And Rosenzweig answered, not yet. Mm-hmm. Not yet. So it was his answer to his friend. And I'm asking you on the deepest level, Ed, what does it mean anything to you that you left Egypt? And if it does, what does it mean?
All right, it's a remarkable question, and I deeply appreciate the question. Let me try and articulate an answer. It's an answer that's been coming to me as I'm getting older. It is really, it is possible, it is probable, and it's even likely that as you live in the world, you grow hopeless. Because the human condition is hopeless. I mean, look, we're mortal, and and death has a powerful way of wiping out everything that's precious in human life while we're living and then afterwards, right? And hopelessness, in the animal world is hopeless in a certain sense. Is this an animal lives and dies and leaves nothing in the world, that of any substance, of any change in the world, and yet here is a possibility. The Torah, the story of the Exodus opens a possibility to move from hopelessness to hope. That moment of crossing the sea, that moment of seeing history become resolved, that moment of seeing injustice resolved and redressed and justice winning, that moment when the slave who has been destroyed, who has been crushed and broken and humiliated and oppressed, stands up free and says, today I am a human being. Today I am a somebody. And not just stands up but dances and sings and begins to articulate a meaning and purpose of their existence, to move from hopelessness to hope. One side of the Red Sea to the other. A place where there's no hope. Pharaoh's coming down the mountain. You can't run away. It's imminent. And yet you cross the sea, and on the other side, there's a real possibility of living a life of meaning, of living a life of purpose, of celebrating the joy of existence instead of despairing over its hopelessness. To me, that's the deeper existential meaning of this. It's the slavery of death. It's the slavery of oblivion. It's the slavery of living as a finite creature in an infinite time and infinite space. And yet God says, I care about you. I care about you, that I'm going to rearrange the whole universe to bring you out of this situation and show you that there's another way, and to show you that you can have an impact on the world and you can sing. So to me, that in the deepest existential sense, if you ask me, it's the liberation from death. It's the liberation from mortality. It's a liberation from limits. It's a liberation from despair and hopelessness into hope, into joy, into purpose, into holiness. That's how I read it. Okay, now you're there.
That's beautiful. That's very, very real. And the part of it that inspires me and connects to me is, and the only sense I can make out of the fact that I was in Egypt and I went out of Egypt, is that despite my rationalistic tendencies, I believe that God is with me in a very personal way. That I am not alone.
Mm-hmm.
Because on a rational basis, I can't get there. On the level of a rational faith, I can't get to the belief that God gives 2 cents about an ant on this little piece of rock flying through space, and that God should care about me? What? It just doesn't make sense rationally. And yet, I believe that the message of being there in Egypt as a slave and leaving as a slave and becoming free means that whatever I go through in my life, I will not go through it alone. I will go through it with a shepherd. I will go through it with a guide, with a partner. And that is the only promise that I carry forever and every day from God. That's the only promise that matters to me. Not a promise of a life without a bump, not a promise of a life without suffering, but a promise of a life that I will live never being alone.
So Moses asks God at the burning bush, when the people ask me, what's your name? What am I supposed to tell them? And that's the issue that you raise, right? For people that have no idea of how the universe, never thought about it, never really thought about it, and you come and you say, there's something more than just your daily experience going on here. There's something powerful at work in your own life, and their question is going to be to you, well, what's its name? What's this God's name? How does this God operate in the world? What does this God expect? What's the payback? I mean, it's the right question. It's exactly the right question.
Right.
You're a good burning bush Jew, Gellman.
Yeah. Don't tell anyone.
Don't tell anyone.
I have a reputation to uphold.
Well, we'll help you with that in a few minutes. So it's.
I had a gift to give you and a challenge here. It's my contribution to the Haggadah. Okay.
Please.
So we have all these questions, and obviously, as you began this discussion here about the Haggadah itself, there's all these questions, and then there's these stories that connect to the questions. So I want to look for a minute at one of the best known, the Arba Banim. Okay,
four sons.
The four sons are well known to everyone who goes through the Seder because it's early enough and people aren't already getting hungry for the brisket. And that is, you've got the four sons, and they're always interpreted as from the best to the least, right? From the most highly evolved to the least spiritually evolved. And my contribution is this. I believe that the four sons are in fact in order, but they're in ascending order, meaning that the lowest spiritual level is the Chacham, the wise son, and the highest spiritual level is the Sheino Yodea Lishol, the one who doesn't know how to ask. All right. So just for a second, if you turn to the part there, you'll see. So here's my case to be made that the four sons are in reverse order. Chacham Ma'u Omer, the wise one, what does he say? Okay, so why is this the lowest spiritual level? Because this enormous event that you so beautifully described and how it implicates us and how it drags us out of our isolation and our hopelessness, this big thing, he asks, what are the little teeny rituals about it? He's asking, there's a term in Yiddish which cannot be translated into English called chnyuk. It's a chnyuk. The best definition of a chnyuk is someone who doesn't even trust his own kosher food.
Right. It's for this guy. It's for these guys that shmura matzah was invented.
That's exactly right.
And the wonderful thing about shmura matzah is anyone ever gives you shmura matzah, try closing your eyes and eating a piece of matzah and then eat a piece of the box.
Exactly.
And tell me which one tastes better.
No difference. So I think he's the lowest level because all he cares about are the minutiae of the rituals. The next level is the Rasha, the evil son. Mahu Omer, Maha Avodah Hazot Lachem. Well, first of all, leave aside the fact that the wise son also asks Etchem, the same thing, asks to you. So the traditional interpretation of the wicked son is that he's wicked because he cuts himself off from the community, but so does the wise son. So that was what my clue was, that the rabbis were doing a little trick here with the four sons. But he says, Ma Avodah Hazot. So he's higher than the wise son because he's not asking what chukim umishpatim. He's not asking what are the minutiae of the laws concerning the Passover. He's saying, what is this avodah? He at least recognizes it as service, sacred service. He's not in it, so he's still on a low level, but he recognizes it as sacred service. The third son is the Tam, who, by the way, isn't even, it's translated as the simpleton, but actually Tam means the pure one, and is really the third. He's higher than the Chacham and the Rasha, because what does he say? Tam Mahu Omer, Mazot. Mazot. And it says, what is this? He's beyond even avodah. He's saying, look, avodah in the rabbinic sense meant, what are the prayers we're supposed to say? What is the prayer service? This guy, the Tam, says, I understand that this is something way bigger than the minutia of mitzvahs or the order of prayer. And that's what the hell is this? And so he's the third highest. The highest of all, and I learned this from my studies of Buddhism, She'eno yodea lishol, the one who doesn't even know what to ask. And you say, what do you say to him? The verse that has animated my life. The verse that I have taken from the Haggadah into my life. Petach lo shenemar, v'higadata levincha bayom hahu lemor, ba'avur zeh asa Adonai li b'tzeitim mitzrayim. The highest level is to know that God did this as a gift. And if God did this as a gift for our ancestors, everything in your life is also a gift. That's my midrash for the.
That's beautiful, Marc. Thank you. That's just wonderful.
Just reverses the four sons.
It's a marvelous way to read it. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll finish here today because there's only so long you can stare at us on television. We want to wish you a good Shabbos. Take good care of each other and take good care during this next week. We'll be back with Torah study next week. We're going to open the Haggadah and look at some more of the passages that animate the Haggadah and animate the Pesach holiday. And during the course of the week, of course, I'll do Lunch and Learn on Wednesday afternoon. We'll be looking at the first chapters of Exodus in order to get us ready for Pesach, and many other opportunities to do Jewish learning this next week among VBS and other offerings all over the internet. So please take some time to learn some Torah. Let this catastrophe be an opportunity to learn as well as to stay safe and stay well. Marc, good Shabbos to you and your family.
Good Shabbos.
Stay well.
Love you.